The second chapter, Beyond the Garden. As babies, we entered the house of creation, the Beit. As we grew up, we were surrounded by loving kindness, the Gimel. We delighted in the natural world around us, the Dalet. The next three letters, Hey, Vav, and Zayin, are the letters of youth. The qualities and experiences they depict are those of the early years, say from 10 to 20 years. We begin to discern the subtleties within the world around us. This is the Hey. We make vital connections. This is the Vav. And we learn the skill and necessity of struggling. That's the Zayin. But let's begin with the Hey. Young people remain focused on the natural world, but something amazing happens. And this is best explained by referring to the shape of the letter Hey. The letter is actually a repeat of the previous one, the Dalet, but it's received a visitor, a little stroke in the lower left of this letter. This is a Yud, which is the 10th letter of the Aleph Beit, and the Yud contains spirituality. So you see, this letter is the natural world of the Dalet, which contains the spirituality of the Yud within it. It was the very first letter, the Yud was, to be uttered by God at the creation. Yehi or, he said, let there be light. You see, the spiritual is embodied within this world like the Yud within the letter Hey, and it was there right from the beginning when God first spoke. Now, why does this letter represent the young person of, say, 10 to 13? I'm talking about the letter Hey. Because then we were beginning to move on from being enthralled with the outer shape of the house of creation, the Dalet, natural world, to suspecting a deeper meaning that maybe we are seeing, as it were, just the container of something unseen and possibly unseeable. Of course, we wouldn't have expressed it like this, but there is no doubt that this is what we began to detect as we entered another stage of life, that there is more than meets the eye. In later life, we may express it as seeing everything from the back, because everything is really facing God. Creation is like a room in which all the furniture is turned to the walls, except there are no walls. I read a report the other day that was boringly entitled Cognitive Development in the Teen Years, but one subheading interested me: abstract thinking. The writer explained that between the age of 12 and 18, we begin to think about possibilities, and it was that word that grabbed me, possibilities. What an amazing thing that is. We begin to look at things not just as they are, but what they could become. We look at the potential, the capacity to develop into something in the future, and that includes ourselves. It was when I was in this chapter, for instance, that I chose to follow Jesus. After months of listening to a good Christian friend, I asked him, "Is God always with you?" To which he answered, "Yes, always." That was enough for me. If he had the potential to have God as his constant companion, then why not me? You see, it was all to do with potential, with seeing possibilities, and in my case, my own potential of becoming something and somebody different in the future. The Dalet, or natural world, obtained a Yud of spirituality, making the letter Hey. And where do we go from here? We enter the world of the Vav. Now, in Hebrew, Vav simply means hook, something that connects two or more things. The letter also means and, which connects words and ideas. The Vav, therefore, has the genius, the power, the essence to connect. This is such an important concept, for without connection, nothing would exist that does exist, or at least everything would be like a collection of tennis balls all bouncing together, nothing really connecting with anything else. Jesus is the great connector. That's another subject, of course, but it does indicate what a vital concept connection is in God's scheme of things. The valve has the power to make connections. And that's what we did after we'd played with the sights, sounds and objects of this world, the Dalet, and begun to detect a deeper value to everything, the Hay. We started to see that there are connections between things. In fact, in reality, everything is interconnected. There's an interesting little story that illustrates this. I once read that the British Empire was only possible because of the bird called the jay. The food source of the jay, like the squirrel, is acorns. They bury them, and the ones they don't retrieve become oak trees. And Nelson's navy was built of English oak, each ship needing on average 2,000 trees. Without the work of the jay throughout the previous centuries, England would not have had the resources to build the strongest navy in the world. Interesting how that is all interconnected with history, even the little jay burying an acorn. Interconnectedness is an exciting discovery that we made in our early years. Another way of looking at it is we began to see things in context, not just figures, separate figures, independent figures, apart from everything, but figures in a landscape, with a landscape around them, and they related to the landscape, and the landscape lent itself to their history, to what they were. Now, I'm not saying that we saw complex connections, of course, when we were still relatively young. We don't. Rather, that we began to recognize that our actions affect others, and vice versa. We were figures in a landscape. Hopefully, with the right encouragement, we developed responsibility. The Vav represents that passage of our lives when we stopped just understanding things and people in isolation, but in context. That's probably the best word we can use, the word context. Our thinking became more sophisticated, almost without us realizing it. And now the Zayin. We moved towards the age of 20, and this was probably the period when we begin to earn a living. And it came as something of a shock. The workplace can be pretty tough, and generally few of us are really prepared for it. You could argue at home, but know that you will never be shoved out into the street, but you can lose your job. The workplace is business, and business can be mean. I walked away from a number of jobs at the beginning. The outside world is hard and often antagonistic to us. It rarely does what we want it to do. And in this chapter of our lives, we learned that we would have to toughen up if we were going to survive. When we were at loggerheads with the world, it was us that would have to change. Living is struggle, and this is the Zayin, the letter of spirit and struggle. I love the letter. It has the shape of a sword, and many Hebrew words of action begin with the Zayin. Some see it as a beacon, a torch. Well, that's a similar truth. We were thrown into the world, and although we had to allow ourselves to be chiseled into shape, we discovered that we also had to hold up our end. We were small and insignificant, but we were somebody. It was a great lesson to learn to hold our own when necessary. We learned that the world would use us as a doormat if we allowed it to. And so we gained something of the spirit of the Zayin. The sword and the torch was added to our characters. We held up the torch of our own dignity. We learned to stand on our own 2 feet. Of course, we had been learning about this struggle for some time. Even as a baby, we learned to cry in order to get something to eat. But we are now learning it in earnest and in the big wide world. We are taking our place in the struggle of life, and because we've been making connections, we've become aware that we're part of a bigger struggle, the battle of life, as it's being called. No one is an island unto himself. It was in this chapter that most people become breadwinners. Now, it's an interesting expression, and here's why. The Zayin also contains the idea of sustenance or breadwinning. But how can the letter of struggle be linked with breadwinning? What is the connection? The word for bread in Hebrew is lechem, and the word for war is milchama. You can see the similarity, the same family of words. The words are related, lechem and milchama. Essentially, war is about winning bread for your family, for your village, for your nation. The ideas are linked. This chapter was something of a rude awakening for us.